guest is Meg Kearney, who understands how it feels to be silenced by people or situations, and how that silence can grow and gnaw until poetry comes along. Meg began writing at age 7 as a way to make sense of an experience that hurt her deeply. Over time, she learned that poetry not only gave her a voice, but allowed her to put on protective masks when necessary, and to remove those masks when she was ready. Meg's poetry has been featured on Garrison Keillor's A Writer's Almanac and has appeared in journals and magazines such as the Gettysburg Review, Plowshares, and Poetry. Meg's first book of poems, An Unkindness of Ravens, was published in 2001, followed by The Secret of Me, a novel in verse for teens. Her second book of poems, Home by Now, was recently released by Four-Way Books. Meg has won many fellowships for her work, and she has taught poetry in several venues, including New School University. She also served as Associate Director of the National Book Foundation for 11 years. Today, Meg is Director of the Solstice Low Residency MFA in Creative Writing program at Pine Manor College and the Solstice Summer Writers Conference. Meg, it's wonderful to have you here.
It's great to be here, Elizabeth. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Would you start by reading a poem?
Sure. I'm going to read a poem from this new book. It's so exciting because I'm just starting to read from it. So I thought I'd start with a poem titled Rescued. Rescued. I've been among the missing, clanging my rusted rattle in the nursery rubble. I've been among the foundlings, poster child for Catholic charity. They sorted us like laundry, separated coloreds from whites. And if there was any doubt about a baby's blood, she was whisked across town to a freelance anthropologist. Though my heart wheezed like a bagpipe, I was saved by my skin, illegitimate but convent white. I thank God for that, and for the man who gave me his name. Do you blame me? I admit it. I did not look back. I couldn't save the others. I batted my big brown eyes at that man and his barren wife, my first act of seduction, and promised to be a good girl.
I love the stark beauty of that poem.
Thank you.
The honesty and the longing. What's interesting to me is that that poem has so much to do with your first book and with what made you start writing in the first place. So could you tell us a little about those early poems and the desire to write?
Yeah, it's funny because, I mean, Longing is the title of the very first poem in the Ravens book. And yeah, I think the first poems that I was writing as a kid, you know, I started writing short stories when I was in 2nd grade, and then I turned to writing poems in 6th grade and kind of never looked back. And I remember writing about being an adopted child and wondering about my birth mother, and, you know, growing up in a family where I was the youngest of 3 adopted children. There was a lot of love and openness in this family, but there was also a lot of things that just unspoken rules about what could be said and what couldn't, you know. So I wrote a poem about wondering who my birth mother was, and I read this to my mother, you know, sat her down on the bed in my room and, you know, made this big performance of reading this poem, and she basically just kind of blanched, and she probably said something like, "Oh, that's very good," you know, before she ran out of the room, but it really marked me, you know. I knew, number one, that I had crossed a line that that I didn't cross again for a long, long time. But I also knew at the same time that, wow, this poetry stuff's pretty powerful, you know. Got a reaction out of her, you know. So I think that's why I kept at it, even though I didn't really write about, you know, being adopted or any feelings around having been given away as a child until I was in my 20s.
Mm.
Yeah.
So what was it when you reached that point in your life where you finally felt that you could say some of the things you hadn't said before?
Well, it came at a time when I was really discovering a lot of other contemporary poets. I went up to a wonderful festival up in Franconia, New Hampshire, the Frost Poetry Festival. And I had a wonderful mentor, a poet named David Keller, who had read my work, and he sat down with me and he said, you know, you keep coming up to the edge of something with these poems, but you know, you're afraid to make the leap. And he had no idea really what he was talking about, because none of these poems had anything to do with, you know, I think, with being adopted or any of that. But I knew exactly what he was saying. And he didn't even know really what he was saying. This was just the feeling he was getting. Like, I just kept coming up to the edge of what I really wanted to talk about, and then I would stop. And it was about that same time that I started having these dreams about ravens, you know, and started writing down the dreams, and then started working on the sequence of the raven poems that make up the middle section of the first book. And the raven really became my mask, my vehicle for talking about emotions that I hadn't talked about since that moment in the room with Mom when I was 12. So that was very freeing in a way, you know, scary, but that was when I really think I made a turn and started really becoming a poet.
You were telling me earlier that when you started to have those dreams, the ravens were actually tugging at your hair.
Yeah, yeah.
Almost as if they were sort of nudging you to do something you weren't quite ready to do. When you started writing those poems, did you feel something shifting? Were the ravens speaking through you, or were they just allowing you to finally say what you needed to say?
No, I felt there was something. There was definitely a shift, and I knew I was probably writing better poems than I'd ever written before, you know. So that was really, even though those poems are at the center of the book, they were really the beginning of the book. And I knew I was onto something, and it was really exciting, you know, to all of a sudden have found a way in. Even though, you know, they are very masked and very obscured, you know, some more than others, you know, in talking about that subject and those emotions. But to me, it was huge, and I was like, wow, I'm coming out of the closet, you know, and everybody's going to know now, but nobody really did, you know.
Well, what's interesting about those poems is that you describe them as a mask. In many ways, they allows you to come closer to that edge.
Yeah, which is really what those masks can do.
Mm-hmm. So when did you know that it was okay to take the mask off? When had you said enough that you could let that go?
Well, in some ways, I still use masks sometimes, you know, in talking about certain things, or just, you know, find that the mask can be a way into a poem. But I had what I thought was, you know, the manuscript for the first book. And of course, you know, you always think you have, right, your manuscript, and it keeps evolving anyway as time goes along. And someone had read the manuscript and said, you know, I love all these raven poems, you know, but I wonder if you could just ever be explicit. I was like, yeah. So that was really kind of a challenge at that point, and I think because I had been able to work through, you know, coming so close to that subject matter through the raven poems, I finally said, I can be explicit, I can do that, you know, and then I wrote a few poems that felt very, you know, like, well, the editor of the book said, this is the hammer coming down finally in this book, you know.
So how did you feel when you were writing those poems? What was it like to finally have the
Oh,
hammer
I was
come
terrified.
down?
I thought my family would never speak to me again.
What was their reaction?
Oh, it's funny. You know, in a lot of ways, I have a very kind of Irish Catholic reticent family, you know, so there's a lot of, you know, oh, we're very proud of you, but nothing specific. And at least I knew they, you know, I didn't even know if they read the book, honestly, but at least they were speaking to me still, and they seemed to be okay with the fact that, somebody was talking about the big family secret, So.
What's really interesting about that book for me is that in many ways you're sort of writing poems that eventually would lead into your experience.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking in particular about the tattoo on your arm. Would
Yeah.
you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. Well, when I was writing that first book, I was at the same time searching for my birth mother. So there was really only maybe one poem in the book that was written post, finding blood relatives. So for 8 years I was searching for my birth mother and writing these poems. And a lot of times the poem knows more than you do. Yeah, and so there was some just really uncanny things. I had learned certain things about who my birth mother was and worked a lot of that into the poems I was working on. But like, for instance, in the Longing poem that I referred to earlier, I have her driving a brand new convertible, and learned later after finding blood relatives that my mother did own. She bought a brand new Corvair convertible after she gave me up for adoption, and that's how she traveled cross country to kind of start her life over again. And I thought that's kind of spooky, But.
And you were also telling me about what your siblings, your blood siblings, told you about your appearance.
Yeah.
Would you share that with us?
Well, I was kind of like, when they met me, it turned out that my birth mother had died of breast cancer at age 44, and here I met them when I was 35. Now everybody knows how old I am. But I was at that time the age that they last remember her being well. And it was like this ghost just walking back into their lives, And they certainly didn't have to do any blood tests to make sure I was the sibling, I was certainly my mother's daughter. I look more like her than either of my siblings do. So for me, that's been the gift, to have photos of her, to have stories about her now, and to know that, I always wanted to look like somebody. And I do. I look very much like my mother.
What's interesting is that you said a minute ago that poetry often leads you places and it knows more than you do. Do you think that's one of the reasons why it may be so frightening initially to get to that edge, and why at the same time, once you have reached that point, there's a certain freedom that comes?
Yeah. Yeah, and you see that in a lot of poets, when I'm working with students, you see, they're approaching something that they're really terrified to write about, and they're terrified for a lot of reasons, and a lot of times the editor on your shoulder is your mother, or a family member, or just people saying you can't write about that, you're not allowed to say that, and you have to really push through, which is where the mask can really come in. I did a whole class at the new school on a whole semester of, we were writing through a different mask every week, and people were writing about stuff that they'd never had the courage to write about before. But the family dog, when you put words in his mouth, he can say a lot more things than you can, So there is a lot of freedom in that, and you kind of push through the scary part.
When you get to the point where you think, oh, okay, I can take off the mask, how do you know that the time is right to do that?
Well, I think it's just different with every poem, and I don't think you're planning it that way, I think just with each poem, I usually I have a line that starts circulating in my head, or a title, and once I start with that, it's usually the first line is the hardest. Just give me that first line and I can go from there. But I'm not making a decision at that point about, do I have a mask on or not? When I was writing the Raven poems, I knew, I was in this sequence, and that's, I just went in with that Raven, mask on. But in general, I don't think I know what I'm doing for a while. So, and maybe if I see that the poem's not working and I can figure out why, then maybe that's when I say, oh, I either have to take this mask off or I need to put on a mask in order to go where I think this poem wants to go. And it's a matter of really listening to what the poem's trying to tell you, trying to get out of its way.
Yeah, because poetry does force you to go places you might not want to go. But when you do that, the silence that you have been struggling with or that has been imposed on you changes.
Yeah.
It's either less encompassing, or maybe it just starts to dissipate altogether.
Yeah, although, I mean, that can be true, and at the same time, I think poems are just as much about what's not said as what's said, and it's really trying to walk that line. You know, silence is very important in poems, as you know. You know, the breath and the line breaks and the stanza breaks, that's all part of the silence. You know, all that white space is part of the silence.
The difference for me, though, is that one type of silence is sort of thrust upon you, and another is chosen.
Yeah.
Because you decide where to leave things out. You decide where the sounds need to be tighter or looser. You decide where you want to be silent.
Right. And that's where the empowerment, I think, really comes in. You know, where finally, you know, maybe you've been in a situation, you know, a child given up for adoption, or you've been in an abusive relationship where you didn't really feel in control of the situation. And that's where, you know, writing can come in and make you feel like, you know, finally it's you who's you're gonna tell the story your way, you know, and you're the one who's in control. So I very much felt that way with writing that first book. Like, finally, you know, I'm the one in control of telling the story the way I want it told, you know, as quirky and weird as it might sound, you know, in some of those poems. But, you know, it was really a growing experience that way.
And language really has the potential to move you forward or to keep you in place. So it makes perfect sense that you needed to get to the point where you felt like you were in control. I think almost every writer has that need. And people who are watching at home who may have been struggling with silences may feel a certain sense of relief knowing that, oh, okay, I do have that option. I can say the way things were. I can have that sense of control. But yet at the same time, poetry always leaves you a little bit out of control.
Yeah, well, that's a good thing, though. You know, it's if you're too much in control, then nothing interesting happens. You know, but a lot of times I think, you know, we do need to be given permission. You know, we do need somebody to say, it's okay to write about this. You know, that's another thing. I've worked with a lot of students on Indian reservations and just environments where there's been a lot of silencing of their own stories, whether they're personal stories or cultural stories, you know. And just by telling them, you know, your story is important and you're the only one who can tell it. You know, your sibling isn't living the same life experience as you, even if she's living in the same house. You know, you're the only one who can tell your story, and the world needs to hear it, you know. And wow, that can really open up a whole new world for people. So it's a gift when, you know, if somebody told me that, and it's a gift I try to kind of pass along.
And in a way, it's a gift that you always have to keep giving yourself, because when you move into new territory subject-wise, you run into some of the same challenges. The editor may be sitting on your shoulder again, and you have to say, no, I give myself permission to say this. But you also have to know when to sort of pull back from the edge.
I found that to be very true in terms of writing this new book. And, you know, I was living in New York on September 11, 2001, and lived there for about a dozen years and left in 2005. And it's impossible to be writing right now, I think, and not have September 11th and just the fact that we're in two wars kind of affect your writing, and it's gonna come in somehow. But at the same time, you know, I didn't want to you know, I wasn't in one of the buildings. I just saw them burning. You know, I have friends who lost, you know, family members, but I didn't, you know, and I didn't want to try to pretend I knew what that was like. So I realized all I could do in the poems that kind of approach talking about September 11th, I could only say what it was like to be me, you know, at that time and in these times that we're living in now.
Mm. What I love about this new book is that it has a different feel than the first one. It's somehow more expansive, it's looser, it's going beyond sort of one central issue, one central wound, and it's exploring different life events that have shaped you.
Yeah.
What surprised you most when you were writing this book?
What surprised me the most? Well, I think what pleased me the most, maybe, was that, you know, I'd been really, I had been trying to be more expansive in what I was writing about, and also I was reading a lot of the Irish poets. You know, I've always loved Yeats, but, you know, reading Seamus Heaney again, and I went to a Paul Muldoon reading, and Eavan Boland is one of my favorite Irish poets, woman poets, and but I heard Paul Muldoon read, and you know, the music in his work is just, it's stunning, you know, and I think that it's part of the Irish tradition, really, to have that kind of really exquisite music in their poetry. And I knew, you know, that might have been lacking in my work up till that point. You know, not that I think the first book was not musical at all, but you know, maybe it just wasn't, it just didn't stretch to the point that I really thought I could go in terms of the music of the line and the sense of sound. So I really started to play with that a lot more and be a lot more aware of the sense of sound in my lines. And I think it really started to show and move me in a whole new direction, you know, because when you're searching for the sound, you start saying things, just like when you're searching for a rhyme, you know, you start saying things you might not have otherwise, you know, you surprise yourself that way. That's where the surprises came in.
Mm-hmm. So in a way, it was a different kind of silence, a different kind of sound than you had been able to explore earlier.
Yeah, right.
So when you are teaching students about putting on a mask, what do they find most freeing or most challenging?
Well, the freeing part is, it's more like it's fun, you know? It's you know, we were writing from the perspective of animals. We were rewriting grim fairy tales, you know, writing from the perspective of an inanimate object in the room. You know, we were going all kinds of weird places and just making it fun. You know, I think that's the best way to, I think, you know, learn to write, is just to make it fun and play. You know, we're just really playing with words. And, you know, you go from playing with sand in the sandbox to now we're just playing with words on the page, you know, and that's where a lot of the fun with the sound comes in too. So I think that's the main thing that I try to, you know, to make students think that it doesn't all have to be doom and gloom, even though I know a lot of my poems are dark, but it's got to be fun, or else why do it? You know?
Good point.
Yeah. So that was the best part, I think, for all of us, is that we just, you know, we weren't going to worry about, you know, did I really write a fantastic poem, or, you know, did we try this? And now, you know, now we know this is one of the tools in our toolbox that, you know, when we need to mask, we know all these different kind of ways we can come at that. So that was the main thing I think we got out of that
Great
class.
answer. Would you read another poem for us?
Sure. I think I'll read, this is the title poem to the book, so it's called Home by Now. And it kind of has a foot in New Hampshire, where I live now, and a foot in New York. So, Home by Now. New Hampshire air curls my hair like a child's hand curls around a finger. Children? No, we tell the realtor, but maybe a dog or two. They'll bark at the mail car, Margaret's Chevy Supreme, and chase the occasional moose here in this place where doors are left unlocked. And it's code green from sunup, meaning go ahead and feel relieved. The terrorists are back where you left them on East 20th Street and Avenue C. In New York, we stocked our emergency packs with whistles and duct tape. In New England, precautions take a milder hue. Don't say pig on a lobster boat or paint the hull blue. Your friends in the city say they'll miss, but don't blame you. They still cringe each time a plane's overhead, one ear cocked for the other shoe.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.